Hey everybody, welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions. As usual, this episode is being posted on Tuesday, but we are actually recording it on Sunday, and unfortunately, just a couple of hours ago, we learned of the tragic loss of one of America's finest actors, Philip Seymour Hoffman, who passed away of apparent drug overdose earlier today. This is devastating to us. He was an amazing performer, but it's also devastating simply because we have lost someone else to drug addiction. And I feel that because we are a podcast dedicated to psychology and state of mind, that we would be remiss if we didn't bring this up and address it in some way. So we were very sorry, and our deepest condolences go out to the friends, the family, and of course the fans as well of Mr. Philip Seymour Hoffman. Andrea, if someone is suffering from some sort of drug addiction, where do you recommend they go?
Well, first, if anyone is feeling hopeless, alone, depressed, they don't know where to go, they need someone to talk to, or they're considering suicide, the first number I want to share is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. Again, 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8225. In regards to substance abuse, there actually is a substance abuse hotline that folks can call if they're struggling with any kind of addiction. That number is the number for SAMHSA. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And that number is 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357.
Okay, so with that, let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions. My name is Brian Ward, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello. And
today we are welcoming you to the 7th episode of the ARKHAM Sessions, where we're going to focus on the episode P.O.V.
Which stands for...
Point of View. But before we get started, we're not normally a news site of any kind. That's not really our thing. We let other people handle that. However, Twitter and Facebook and news sites and the internet basically went into a frenzy on Friday with another little bit of casting news for DC, from DC and Warner Brothers for the new Batman vs. Superman. We've got Jeremy Irons as everyone's favorite butler, Alfred. And we've got Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor. Drea, really quick, your opinions on those castings.
Too old, too young.
Jesse Eisenberg, too old to play Lex Luthor. You heard it here first. Way too old.
No, I'm just kidding. Irons is fantastic. I think that he would be wonderful as Alfred.
You know what I think is interesting about Irons as Alfred? I was thinking back, and I could be wrong, but I was thinking back to all the on-screen Alfreds that we've ever seen. And I think physically, he is the closest to what is traditionally drawn, illustrated as Alfred. Black hair, slender. They'll probably give him a mustache, I would imagine. But most of the other Alfreds haven't had mustaches. They've all been elderly, white-haired, from Michael Gough to Michael Caine, etc. Like, they traditionally, they don't generally, even dating back to 1966, they don't generally look the way that they've been illustrated. But I think Jeremy Irons kind of fits a little bit.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think he's suitable for the role as far as his acting and his characterization, or what could be a really great characterization of Alfred.
And then Eisenberg as Luthor.
Again, he just seems really young, but I imagine that's because Clark is still very young.
Eisenberg is a unique choice for me. I kind of like that they're going outside the box. I'm not sure that I'm always happy with the idea of a Lex Luthor that is a contemporary to Superman. I would almost, while I know nothing about the story or the script, I would almost like to see, for that brief period of time, Lex Luthor was president of the United States. I would kind of like to see Superman going up against the president of the United States. Two American icons kind of going up against one another, and a super criminal who's already at the height of power. I think that would be interesting, and obviously Eisenberg wouldn't fit that kind of role. But anyway,
Right.
What do you guys think? Hit us up on Twitter at ARKHAM Sessions. Let us know, and we'll all take this conversation online. But let us move right into the episode.
It ought to be a hot one.
Very dark episode. It takes place at night. So, it helps.
This whole episode takes place, I think, is that within one night? Is that what you just said?
It might be one night. I imagine it's probably over the one night. So that means that Renee Montoya and Officer Wilkes are night shift folk. I guess you would have to be if you're dealing with Batman, because he doesn't really hang out during the day.
Right.
But this episode was the story came from Mitch Bryan. The teleplay was actually written by Sean Catherine Derrick and Laren Bright. And the episode was directed by Kevin Altieri. It aired in mid-September. It was September 18th, 1992. And once again features one of your favorite characters, Renee Montoya.
At this point, she's a police officer, and she's working alongside a partner. I don't think we've seen him before. He's just sort of another...
He's referred throughout the episode as the Rookie. So
Right.
this is probably one of his first. And we first see them as they're in a car speeding toward an unknown destination. Renee is behind the wheel. And Wilkes is in the passenger seat, terrified by her driving.
Relax.
By the way, if you happen to see, did you see, on ARKHAM Sessions' Twitter account later last week, we posted, there was a screenshot of Montoya and Wilkes. Apparently, you and I star in this episode.
It definitely looks like us hanging out in a police car.
Yeah.
I look very determined and intelligent, and you look freaked out and confused.
Yeah, terrified. I've been in a car with you where you've been driving, and I am terrified.
I'm usually driving toward a burning building.
Yeah.
Trying to,
just because.
find Batman.
Yeah. So they get to this warehouse, and Bullock is incapacitated. He is on the ground, sort of wiped out from having already gone in before he was supposed to, or were they late?
Que cara. We weren't late.
We don't know exactly. We only know that something has gone down, the place is on fire, and the criminals are getting away. Batman is seen on the roof, and then we go into... presumably later that night with an internal affairs investigator. That's Lieutenant Hackle. And he is grilling these three people on their versions of the story.
Either you start coming up with some answers or hand over your badges.
Right, so we've got Detective Bullock and officers Renee Montoya and Wilkes, who are essentially sitting in these chairs and being interrogated. And interestingly, I think this is why it's called P.O.V, is that they all have a different account of what actually happened, what they experienced that night when they ran into this this crime and Batman being involved in some way.
Right. So, Andrea, I don't know what you took away from this being the clinical professional, but it seems like we're basically dealing with a he said, she said, what he said, she said, and he said.
What we've got here is three cops with two stories.
Essentially, it's Bullock against the other two officers. Were they late? Did Bullock feel the need to go into the building before they got there because they weren't on time, etc.? But ultimately...
Well, I mean, I hate to interrupt, but I have to actually say that when you watch this episode, you actually do see 3 points of view or 3 perspectives. They do a nice
But they aren't all of the same story. Wilkes' story
exactly
is different from Montoya.
That's what I mean, that there are 3 distinct stories told about the same event. Bullock, basically his story is that he's this heroic detective who, goes into this building, catches these criminals, during the act of stealing all this money, and somehow Batman gets involved and Bullock saves Batman's life.
It took my last bit of strength to get us out.
Interestingly, the rookie cop has a story where he also interacts with Batman, but he interprets all of Batman's moves as very, like, superhuman, right? So when he talks about Batman, I guess he's shooting a grapple hook and it's electrified or something, and what this cop says is like,
Then he pointed his fingers, and some kind of ray shot out at the van. It blew the door open.
Which, if you actually watch the show, you're seeing that Batman is using his practical tools to get the bad guys. So it's sort of interesting that this rookie cop sees Batman as superhuman and certainly heroic and above, certainly it has abilities that they don't have. While Bullock's perspective is, Batman is failing. He's not capable of doing his job. He's getting in the way. And ultimately that the police department has to save Batman. That's sort of the perspective we get from him.
But as we've always seen, Bullock has it out for Batman and therefore would never get him credit for anything.
Right. His perspective, his account of what happened is very consistent with his, I've used this word before, his schema about Batman, his thoughts and beliefs.
His prejudice.
You can call it prejudice, yeah. I mean, it's sort of his... the units of mental kind of beliefs and values around other people, other situations, things. And so it makes a lot of sense to me as we see these 3 different accounts that they're all very different. And finally, Renee's account of what happened is interesting because in her account, Batman comes onto the scene, he's in the building, but he ends up she says he's buried alive.
Poor Batman.
Her perspective, I think, is that Batman's just like us. She sees the equality in the situation, and sees him as certainly effortful and heroic, but she sees him as being fallible, and because he's buried alive, I think that's it's completely different perspective than the other 2.
And she appears to have a more realistic, probably the most realistic perspective, because he was in fact buried alive by burning.
Who said?
By the burning roof. Well,
who saw that? Not
only did we see it, but then she, after being relieved of duty, is heading home, solves the crime essentially, goes to the docks, and actually finds Batman hanging from a rope. The criminal's all there, and one of the criminals even mentions,
well, he's already been chop-broiled.
So clearly she was pretty accurate in that Batman didn't get out from underneath when he saved her by pushing her out of the way. And then Renee basically helps Batman save the day.
Yeah, I mean, the last half of the episode is essentially Renee and Batman working together, collaborating, fighting these criminals, and we see her really hold up her own. I mean, she's punching and kicking and throwing these guys down. She's using some really she's using some intellect and problem-solving skills to get herself and Batman out of there. So I think it's a pretty cool ending to the episode. So
let's talk about perspective and memories, particularly after trauma or an event like this. It's funny. I always think back to the fact that that the police always say that after you're mugged or after you witness a crime, oftentimes your memory of what the person looked like isn't always accurate. In fact, is rarely accurate based on some analysis. From a psychological perspective, what is your take on these three people's account of what happened?
Well, as I said, they all have very different accounts, and I see that almost like it's sort of a projective test in the sense that their account of what happened is hugely based on their own schemas, their own prejudices, their own experiences. And so, you know, as I said, as we talked about, Bullock sees this scenario, or his perception of what happened pretty much characterizes Batman as being a failure and getting in the way, and not working with the police. Meanwhile, this new cop's perspective is that Batman is a superhero. He has abilities that no one else has, and you know, this guy's pretty much in awe of all of the superpowers that Batman has, and so he kind of holds him, you know, up on this pedestal. And that may be because maybe he is less experienced in the force, maybe he's younger, maybe he's heard stories about Batman, has not ever seen him before, and so I think that's quite consistent with his account. And Renee, I mean, we know that she's seen Batman before. We know that she may be, as you said, I don't know if it's more accurate, but her perspective is grounded in reality, maybe to the degree that she's able to see Batman's faults. She's also able to see how she can help and contribute to, you know, to getting these guys. So I see those almost as, like I said, projective tests, but I also feel like they did a really nice, you know, without really being explicit about it, they were teaching us about psychology in this episode. We were understanding that perceptions of an event can be incredibly different depending on who you're asking. And we also understand that interrogation, asking questions, can really impact the way that people are remembering things, especially in regards to like their emotions and their responses, and how they're able to tell the story, recall details of the story. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Something, I do have one critique of this episode, and I realize that it's an animated series and was sort of designed for children. But it's funny because it reminded me a lot. There's an old movie from the early 50s. It was 51, 52. It was Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon. And this movie was all about basically this woodsman, this woodcutter, comes in and says that he found the body of a dead samurai. And we see these events unfold through the perspectives of four different people. There's the woodcutter, there is the wife of the samurai, there is the samurai himself who tells the story, albeit through like a psychic or a medium in the courtroom. And then we also see the perspective of the story as told by the bandit. And the difference, the thing about this particular episode of the animated series that I think the original movie, Rashomon, and I don't know that they got this idea from Rashomon. It's been done before, or it's been done since. But the interesting thing about that movie is that you don't necessarily know that one person is not telling the truth, or that another person sees it just entirely differently. In this episode, while Harvey is telling his story, you see that he's lying.
That's true. He says, you know, I heard a noise and it must have been Batman, and it's actually him. Like,
he's kicking over a can. Yeah, it's like you can see, and he comes right out and says that he saved Batman when in fact he didn't.
No, Batman saved him.
Batman saved him. So he's clearly lying. It's not a perception issue.
Well, you know, I would argue that we don't know that Bullock is actually lying.
Well, I think that the directors are showing us, though. I think they are showing us the truth. And in 22 minutes, you don't necessarily have an opportunity. So we're seeing that Bullock isn't honest. We're also seeing from the perspective of Wilkes that the sparkles that are coming out of they're supposedly coming out of Batman's hands aren't in fact magic. It is yet another sort of it's the little bombs,
His bat bombs.
His bat bombs. So it's like we see what is the truth while watching these. But I would
argue, I actually would argue that it allows us to understand that perception can be distorted.
Sure.
So I actually like that they're showing, okay, what factually happened is, Bullock is tripping on a can.
Right.
What Batman is actually using are these practical weapons or things that anyone with training can use. They're not superpowers. And I think what's great about that is we understand that recall and memory can be distorted, and that we can actually misremember, or we can, really believe that something happened,
right,
and it actually didn't happen, which is actually very true. Like you said, actually a lot of research has shown that, eyewitness testimonies or, eyewitness IDing of criminals can actually be really, really faulty, and that, research shows between 30 to 50% of those eyewitness accounts when people ID a person they're actually wrong. So I think that that's a nice sort of a nice way to kind of teach us that memory can be distorted, and that we can really believe that we saw something, but it didn't really happen.
They did do a decent way of showing us the reality as we were listening to the accounts. I just kind of wish, and I know it's weird to say, but there was actually an episode of Alvin and the Chipmunks that did this as well. And they actually did sort of a Rashomon. They were in a courtroom. Simon was the judge. And
of course.
And they were trying to determine who, I think it was a statue at school, who knocked over the statue or who did something in the courtyard. And then it turns out from the perspectives of all this testimony that actually they all had something to do with it. But you legitimately saw what those people believed they saw. And in this particular episode of Batman the Animated Series, I don't think we ever really saw what people thought they saw. We saw the truth and heard what they thought they saw. And it wasn't as effective for me as an adult watching this animated series that is designed for children. But, that's my only critique.
Fair enough. You also critiqued that, Wilkes was left-handed in the beginning of the episode, and
they were both left-handed. No. Let's make something very clear. Both Montoya and Wilkes apparently are ambidextrous. They were both carrying their shotguns ready to fire with their left hands on the trigger, and then later on were using their right hands on the trigger. So they are clearly ambidextrous.
I don't think anyone notices that in detail.
I'm just saying, I noticed it.
So let's go back to eyewitness testimony, or what's also called eyewitness recall. Psychologists would call it eyewitness recall, which is, of course, a person's account of an event, usually an event that involved a crime. And actually, a lot of research studies have looked into this and found that a number of different factors do kind of affect the way that we remember things, or I should say, how we can remember them accurately or inaccurately. One thing is anxiety or stress. So if a person is experiencing a lot of fear, anxiety, or stress during the event, that may lessen their ability to remember certain details. There's actually a lot of research that goes into, you mentioned weapons, like some of the officers are holding guns. Sometimes people who are witnessing an event or involved in an event just focus on the weapon, and that keeps them from focusing on details of the perpetrator or the criminal. I don't know. I mean, there's a moment where Montoya is faced with, I think it's a giant drill, and that criminal, in the credits, his name is, he's known as Driller.
Right.
Voiced by Ron Perlman.
My pleasure.
Anyway, so he is he's pointing this drill at her, and I would even say, I mean, as we watch it, when we're focusing on that drill, do we notice the details of his face, of his height, of his ethnicity or race? If I were to tell a police officer later that this, that I was assaulted by this person, would I remember all these details? And some research shows that if there's a weapon involved, we may know a lot of details about that weapon, but not enough details about the perpetrator to really inform the police appropriately enough or accurately enough.
Makes sense if you're focused on the weapon, then yeah, it kind of makes sense.
Right. Another thing that we know is that memory erodes over time. So, depending on how soon this lieutenant was questioning these three cops,
It's a good thing he was presumably questioning them that night.
I know, it's interesting. I think it was the same night, but we do know that memory erodes over time. And what we do, this idea that we remember things like a videotape, or I should say a video file, since videotapes are a bit dated.
And they erode over time.
And those actually erode over time. So unlike a video clip, I should say, where, you see everything in this linear way, we remember things depending on meaning, and our brain actually fills in the gaps. So you would remember a situation one way based on the schemas that you have, and I would remember it maybe slightly differently, perhaps somewhat similarly, but I use meaning and I use my experiences and my schemas to fill in those gaps as well. So I think that this episode really does a great job of kind of showing us the personalities and characters of these three cops. And the show wanted us to know Bullock just cares about himself, doesn't see the value in Batman. This new guy is sort of like us. We see Batman as infallible and super heroic and, super talented and superhuman. And Renee sees him as an equal. And in fact, later in the episode, we see her stand up right next to him, punching and kicking and getting at these bad guys, because she actually believes that she could be there right with him to defend herself and to really, basically fight along with him, which I think is really cool about her.
So because I didn't actually go to school to become a doctor, I had other things going on.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe were there any sort of, this might be a weird question. Have there ever been any research studies on memory, storytelling and memory and, how accurate things are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there have been. Actually, for many decades, researchers and psychologists were interested in how stories were retold and how, generation after generation, some stories would sort of turn into fables or folktales. And so one very, very well-known research study was actually back in the 30s, and it was called The War of the Ghosts. And the premise of the study was to show that a story would actually change after many retellings. And so what they did was they actually, apparently the War of the Ghosts was a real folk tale, some North American folk tale that some folks knew about. And they had people or participants tell the story to another person, and then that person would tell the story to another person and so forth. We would call that...
It could be like a game of telephone?
Yeah, it's kind of like telephone. And over time, they actually found that the story changed substantially in terms of the characters involved, in terms of details of the story. And what they learned from this is that we, like I said, we try to fit what we remember with what we already know about. So again, we fill in the gaps. If there's something we don't remember, if there's something that is unfamiliar even, we will use our own experiences, the way in which we understand the world, and we would fill in the gaps with that information. So essentially, we are reconstructing our memories to conform to our personal beliefs about other people, other situations, the world around us.
Cool. So that's all I've got on this episode. How about you?
Yeah, I think that was, it's interesting. There wasn't one, big baddie or villain that we were focusing on, but I think this was a great episode to kind of talk about perception, memory, and false memories.
Cool. So join us next week, gang, when we'll be going into episode 8, The Forgotten, which is actually one of the episodes that sticks out in my mind more than any other when thinking back to Batman the Animated Series.
That's funny because I had forgotten about this one.
You'll remember it.
Oh.
It's Bruce Wayne with amnesia in like a prison sort of setting.
Oh, yes.
Remember the, yeah. So this is an awesome episode. You guys need to come back. Until then, if you've not caught up on the other episodes of the ARKHAM Sessions, because this one deals with psychology, of course, but of course we've also gone, Andrea has gone to great lengths to analyze Man-Bat and the Joker and the Scarecrow and Poison Ivy, etc. So go back and listen to episodes 1 through 6 for sure. You can find us on iTunes. You can also find us on YouTube if you're watching us on YouTube.
Yep. And if you have questions, just tweet us.
Please tweet us at ARKHAM Sessions or at bward028 or
at Arkham Asylum Doc. I won't spell Arkham Asylum because I'm assuming you know how to spell that.
That's right. So join us again next week. Until then, have a great week, and we'll see you soon.
Adios.
Quick, your opinions on those castings.
Too old, too young.
Jesse Eisenberg, too old to play Lex Luthor. You heard it here first. Way too old.
No, I'm just kidding. Irons is fantastic. I think that he would be wonderful as Alfred.
You know what I think is interesting about Irons as Alfred? I was thinking back, and I could be wrong, but I was thinking back to all the on-screen Alfreds that we've ever seen. And I think physically, he is the closest to what is traditionally drawn, illustrated as Alfred. Black hair, slender. They'll probably give him a mustache, I would imagine. But most of the other Alfreds haven't had mustaches. They've all been elderly, white-haired, from Michael Gough to Michael Caine, etc. Like, they traditionally, they don't generally, even dating back to 1966, they don't generally look the way that they've been illustrated. But I think Jeremy Irons kind of fits a little bit.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I think alone, depressed, they don't know where to go, they need someone to talk to, or they're considering suicide. The first number I want to share is the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is 1-800-273-TALK. Again, 1-800-273-TALK. That's 1-800-273-8225. In regards to substance abuse, there actually is a substance abuse hotline that folks can call if they're struggling with any kind of addiction. That number is the number for SAMHSA. SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. And that number is 1-800-662-HELP. That's 1-800-662-4357.
Okay, so with that, let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions. As usual, this episode is being posted on Tuesday, but we are actually recording it on Sunday, and unfortunately, just a couple of hours ago, we learned of the tragic loss of one of America's finest actors, Philip Seymour Hoffman, who passed away of apparent drug overdose earlier today. This is devastating to us. He was an amazing performer, but it's also devastating simply because we have lost someone else to drug addiction. And I feel that because we are a podcast dedicated to psychology and state of mind, that we would be remiss if we didn't bring this up and address it in some way. So we were very sorry, and our deepest condolences go out to the friends, the family, and of course the fans as well of Mr. Philip Seymour Hoffman. Andrea, if someone is suffering from some sort of drug addiction, where do you recommend they go?
Well, first, if anyone is feeling hopeless, he's suitable for the role as far as his acting and his characterization, or what could be a really great characterization of Alfred.
And then Eisenberg as Luthor.
Again, he just seems really young, but I imagine that's because Clark is still very young.
Eisenberg is a unique choice for me. I kind of like that they're going outside the box. I'm not sure that I'm always happy with the idea of a Lex Luthor that is a contemporary to Superman. I would almost, while I know nothing about the story or the script, I would almost like to see, for that brief period of time, Lex Luthor was president of the United States. I would kind of like to see Superman going up against the President of the United States. Two American icons kind of going up against one another, and a super criminal who's already at the height of power. I think that would be interesting, and obviously Eisenberg wouldn't fit that kind of role. But anyway,
Right.
What do you guys think? Hit us up on Twitter at ARKHAM Sessions. Let us know. Hey everybody, welcome to the ARKHAM Sessions. My name is Brian Ward, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Andrea Letamendi.
Hello.
And today we are welcoming you to the 7th episode of the ARKHAM Sessions, where we're going to focus on the episode P.O.V.
Which stands for...
Point of View. But before we get started, we're not normally a news site of any kind. That's not really our thing. We let other people handle that. However, Twitter and Facebook and news sites and the internet basically went into a frenzy on Friday with another little bit of casting news for DC, from DC and Warner Brothers, for the new Batman vs. Superman. We've got Jeremy Irons as everyone's favorite butler, Alfred. And we've got Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor. Andrea, really